like to share with you a rather rare old document that was published originally in the American Anthropologist, Volume 3, September 1901, titled Summary of the Archaeology of Saginaw Valley, Michigan, by Harlan I. Smith, this pertaining specifically to the Saginaw River Valley, Bay County. The report begins, Saginaw River. The history of Saginaw County states that the water courses of the district comprise the Sauk, or home of the Sauks. This next one, bear with me, is Tich Aga in the Bewin village site. The history of Saginaw County states that it must also be remembered that the great camp, or Kpe Shawink, of the wandering bands did not hold the same position in the summer as in the winter, so that he who relies upon Indian legends simply and without further inquiry might associate the summer camp on the lakeshore with the winter camp of the interior. Both were great camps. The second, or summer camp, was north of Neshkotayonk, and the first in coming down from the lake. In winter, the bayshore camp was called Tisha Ge Biwin by travelers as being close by the great camp, and in summer a reversal of terms was simply used to denote the upper camp was a place close by. Neshkotayonk village site, the history of Saginaw County, states that the summer camp was north of Neshkotayonk. McCormick Mound. W.R. McCormick's, referring to the Water Street Mound, wrote as follows. Some 30 rods below on Water Street between 22nd and 23rd Streets is an elevation the highest on the river, on which is located the Bay City Brewery, Barney Hotel, the residence of W.R. McCormick, and other residences comprising nearly 2 acres. I wish to describe this elevation as I saw it in a state of nature over 45 years ago. For many years, it was considered to be a natural elevation of the land, but subsequent excavations have proved it to have been constructed by some remote race of people. When I first became acquainted with the location, it was covered with a dense growth of timber, with the exception of the mound and about 1.5 acres in the rear of it, where the earth was taken from to build the mound. It was then a duck pond, with water 3 feet deep, grown up with alder bushes. In grading 22nd Street through the north end of the mound some years since, we found at a depth of 11 feet 3 skeletons of a very large stature with earthen pots at the head of each. In excavating for the cellar of the Bay City Brewery, we found at a depth of 4 feet the remains of Indians in good state of preservation, with high cheekbones and receding forehead, while below these, again at a depth of 4 or 5 feet, the remains of a more ancient race of an entirely different formation of skull, and with those burned stone implements and pottery were found. I have been unable to preserve any of these skulls, as they crumbled to dust when exposed to the air. I found one skeleton in a sitting position, facing the west, with a very narrow head and long as if it had been compressed. I laid it aside in hopes to preserve it, but in a few hours it had crumbled to pieces. This mound is full of the remains of ancient pottery and small stones that have been through the action of fire. A friend of mine found an awl made of copper, which was quite soft, with the exception of about 1 inch from the point, which was so hard that a file would scarcely make an impression on it. This seems to me to show that the mound builders had the art of hardening copper. The use of the word race instead of tribe is probably a mistake in nomenclature, since the author evidently did not refer to the early Europeans, explorers, or settlers. The statement that skeletons of a very large size were found is probably due to misjudgment. Such remarks are commonly heard in the folklore repeated to explorers throughout the region. It is still possible that this site is a natural hill in which were graves, and that the duck pond was also natural and not the source of the material of which the mound was made. Many of the hills in this region are formed by the wind and are increased and decreased by the same means. This would satisfactorily account for the burials at different depths. Fragile bones that would crumble on exposure to the direct rays of the sun, or even to dry air, may often be preserved without the use of other means than by wrapping in paper and boxing quickly so as to retain the moisture and allow them to dry slowly enough to become hard without warping. While the narrow skull described by Mr. McCormick may have been a case of post-mortem deformation due to the pressure of the soil, it may more probably have been the skull of a rarer of two types, since not only the Sauk and Ojibwe have inhabited the region, but the Potawatomi and other tribes have visited it. And again, two forms of crania have been found elsewhere in this valley. The statement that part of the point of the awl was so hard that a file would scarcely make an impression on it is a fallacy probably derived from the feel and effect on the file of the thickly oxidized metal as compared with that of a clean piece of metallic copper. The term mound builders, as used by Mr. McCormick, probably refers to a mysterious extinct people, whereas the word Indians would doubtless have been more suitable in this connection. William McCormick states that in the vicinity of the residence of William R. McCormick, that being the highest land and where the Sauk had attempted to fortify themselves, at the present time, by digging in this hill you will find it full of human bones. Mr. McCormick, referring to the mounds of Saginaw Valley, states that the plow has helped to level many of them, with the exception of the Fraser, Fitzhugh, and McCormick mounds. And to prove that the last three are artificial and not natural is the fact that in the rear of all these are low places, showing where the earth had been taken from to build the mounds. Again, the soil of the mounds differs from the soil around them, with the exception of low places referred to from wherein the earth was taken. And in no part of the valley will you find those relics except in those mounds. The description of the varieties of soil is perhaps too arbitrary, and specimens such as are found in the mounds are found also on village sites. Professor Thomas states that there is a large artificial elevation on Water Street in Bay City, East Side. Described by W.K. McCormick in Michigan Pioneer Collection, Volume 4, 1831. Water Street Mounds, W.R. McCormick wrote as follows: on the Saginaw River towards its mouth, when we come to what is now the corner of 24th and Water Streets in Bay City, where the center house now stands, we find the old McCormick homestead. Here were two large mounds in the garden, which my father plowed and scraped down. They contained a number of skeletons, stone axes, knives, and quite an amount of broken pottery. Professor Thomas states that the two large mounds now gone stood on the east side of the Saginaw River at the corner of 24th and Water Streets, Bay City, and they were described again by W.K. McCormick in Michigan Pioneer Collections in 1881, Volume 4. Moore Mound. W.R. McCormick wrote as follows: we will now pass over to the west side near the mill of Moore, Smith and Company. There were here, 45 years ago, a mound just above the mill, about 100 feet across in a circular form and about 3 feet high. Originally it must have been much higher. I have never examined this mound, but have understood from old settlers that there were a great many stone implements found in it. The plow was nearly leveled, or has nearly leveled it, so that it is scarcely noticeable anymore. Professor Thomas states that there was a mound on the west side near the mill of M. Smith and Company, as described again by McCormick, W.K. McCormick in the Michigan Pioneer Collection. The West Bay City Village Site. On the sand ridge close to the river at West Bay City, where the railroad roundhouse is located, were found fragments of chert and burned stones in sufficient numbers to suggest that this place had been a village site. West Bay City Graves. In the West Bay City Village site, several human skeletons were dug out by the railroad section workmen, one of whom on inquiry reported the same. The place of these graves appeared to be a natural sand ridge in which interments had been made. The burial site may be identical with what Mr. McCormick terms the Bernie Mounds, and now the Bernie Mounds. Again, W.R. McCormick wrote as follows: the mound, which was located near the west end of the Detroit and Bay City Railroad Bridge, which for reference I will call the Bernie Mound, as it is located on the lands of that great philanthropist, the late Honorable James G. Birney. The mound was not so large in circumference, but much higher than the one just noticed. In this were also found human bones in much better state of preservation than any of the rest, and I procured from this mound a skull with a hole in it just above the temple bone, produced by a sharp instrument which undoubtedly caused death. This skull I presented to J. Morgan Jennison of Philadelphia. It was of an entirely different formation from the Indian skull of the present day, as it did not have their high cheekbones nor their receding forehead, but a very intellectually developed head, showing that it was a different race of the people from the Indians. Some years since, boys were digging in the side of the mound, as they had often done before, to get angleworms for fishing, when they came across a small silver canoe about 5 inches long. A gentleman who was fishing with them offered them 50 cents for it, which they accepted. And after cleaning it up, he found it to be of exquisite workmanship, with the projecting ends tipped in gold. Was not this a present from some early Catholic missionary, of whom history makes no mention? A rough copper kettle of peculiar shape and make, having been wrought into the shape by hammering, without any seam, was also taken from one of these mounds, and is now in the state capitol amongst Mr. O.A. Jennison's collections of antiquities. On August 28, 1890, Mr. McCormick told the writer that the hole in the skull above mentioned may have been made as a post-mortem religious custom. Regarding the remarks concerning the shape of the skull, it must be remembered that, at the time Mr. McCormick wrote, exact somatologic methods were unknown in this section, and the great difference in the shape of skull from that of the others found, unless the skull were that of a Caucasian, possibly an early French voyager, was probably exaggerated owing to the lack of familiarity with crania. The word race in this connection, as in others, is used indiscreetly by the author. The silver canoe may have been introduced after the first contact with the early French traders. It suggests that the burial was comparatively recent. The Burney Mound may have been merely a natural sand ridge in which there were graves, and possibly is identical with the site of the West Bay City graves. Professor Thomas states that a mound formerly stood near the west end of the Detroit and Bay City Railroad Bridge on the land of James G. Burney, described again by W.K. McCormick in the Michigan Pioneer Collections, Volume 4, 1881. The Lin graves. W.R. McCormick's referring to his preceding item about the Burney Mounds wrote as follows. The next mound was about half a mile up the river and formerly stood in the center of Lynn Street, West Bay City, but has been graded down many years since. I was not there at the time, but was informed by others that it contained human bones and stone implements. Charles E. Jennison, a pioneer of Bay City, informed me that he dug up 2 skeletons many years ago in the side of this mound. He found with the skeletons two copper kettles, which he has still in his possession. I'm inclined to think that these were not the remains of the original mound builders, but a race of a subsequent period. On August 28, 1890, Mr. McCormick told the writer that the mound was 50 or 60 feet in diameter and 12 feet high. The copper kettles suggest that the bodies with which they were found were buried since the advent of the whites, and that the site was a burial place in the sand knoll rather than a mound. Professor Thomas states that another, referring to his preceding item about the Burney Mounds, stood half-mile up the river, same side west, at what is now the center of Lean Street, West Bay City. He also mentions that copper kettles were found and that the information was derived again from W.K. McCormick in Michigan Pioneer Collection, Volume 4, 1881. Fitzhugh graves. W.R. McCormick, referring to his preceding items about the Lynn graves, wrote as follows. We now proceed a half-mile more up the river to the rise of ground in the rear of Frank Fitzhugh's grist mill. This elevation 45 years ago, when I first saw it, was the most picturesque spot on the Saginaw River. Here was also a beautiful spring of cold water and was a favorite camping ground of the Indians. It was also, according to the Indian tradition, the original site of the Sauk village and where the great battle was fought when the Chippewas exterminated that nation. This I will call the Fitzhugh Mound, as it is on the lands of Frank Fitzhugh. This elevation, comprising 2 or 3 acres, was always thought to be natural, but I am satisfied from recent excavations and a low place to the southwest that the earth has been taken from this point to rise the mound higher than the surrounding land, and that it is therefore mostly artificial. Then again, the land adjoining on the north is a yellow sand, while on the south the land fell off abruptly and is composed of the same kind of soil as the mound, black sand and loam, from where the earth was taken. I am now speaking of this mound as it appeared 45 years ago. Since then, the railroad company have excavated a part of it for ballasting up their road, and many other excavations and alterations have taken place so that it has not the same appearance it had when I first saw it. Some years since, Mr. Fitzhugh, or the village authorities of Winona, now West Bay City, excavated a street through this mound which brought to light many relics and provided beyond a doubt that this eminence was a mound built in remote ages. A great many skeletons were exhumed, together with a great many ornaments of silver, broken pottery, stone implements, etc., and like the McCormick mound on the opposite side of the river, was full of broken stone which had been through the action of fire. The site is probably a sand ridge with graves in it and a natural pond near it. The ornaments of silver were doubtless the traders' ornaments commonly found in the region and suggest that the graves were made since the advent of the whites. On August 28, 1890, Mr. W.R. McCormick informed the writer that this mound was oblong and covered an acre and a half. Mr. McCormick, referring to the mounds of the Saginaw Valley, states that the plow has helped to level many of them with the exception of the Fraser, Fitzhugh, and McCormick mounds. And to prove that the last three are artificial and not natural is the fact that in the rear of all of these are low places showing where the earth had been taken from or procured to build the mounds. Again, the soil on the mounds differs from the soil around them, with the exception of the low places referred to from whence the earth was taken. And in no part of the valley will you find those relics except in those mounds. The statement regarding the varieties of soil is perhaps too arbitrary, and specimens such as are found in the mounds are found also on village sites. Professor Thomas states that there is half a mile further up the river on the same side, referring to his preceding item about the Lin graves west side, an artificial excavation back of Frank Fitzhugh's grist mill, now considerably disfigured. Many relics were found in it. Fitzhugh village site. W.R. McCormick's referring to his preceding item about the Lin graves wrote as follows. We now proceed a half mile more up the river to the rise of ground in the rear of Frank Fitzhugh's grist mill. This elevation 45 years ago, when I first saw it, was the most picturesque spot on the Saginaw River. And as I've already stated, it was the village where the Chippewas supposedly exterminated the Sauk Nation. William McCormick states that the main village of the Sauks stood on the west side of the Saginaw River, just below where the residence of Mr. Frank Fitzhugh now is, and opposite the mill of the Honorable N.B. Bradley. He further states that on the west side of the river, the main village of the Sauks was located across the river from another village, the Portsmouth village site, which stood near where the courthouse now stands near the ferry in Portsmouth. The Portsmouth village site. William McCormick states that across the river from the main village of the Sauk, there was another village which stood near where the courthouse now stands near the ferry in Portsmouth. The West Bay City Mound. On August 28, 1890, Mr. W.R. McCormick informed the writer that on the west side of the Saginaw River near Peter Smith's Mill in the first ward of Bay City, there was a very high sacrificial mound of conical form. Saginaw village site. William McCormick's referring to Skull Island states that just below this locality lies Saginaw upon a high bank on the west side of the river. This is the Saginaw of the Red Man, and the only place known by him by that name. The meaning of the word is the land of the Sauks. The place known to the white men as Saginaw lies 12 miles more up the river and is called Cape Shawink. Skull Island graves. William McCormick relates that Skull Island, which is the next island above what is now Stones Island, is known as Skull Island from a number of skulls found on it. He further relates that about 12 miles below Saginaw City is Skull Island, so named by the Indians in consideration that upon it exists an endless quantity of dead heads which were left here after the great fight years long past between the Chippewa and the Sauks. Christening about 2 acres of that island, the approximate date given is 1520, massacre of the Sauks by the Ocheepewas. The writer has found no place named Bad Island or Skull Island on any map and suspects that the former term, at least, was used descriptively in that instance only was perpetuated by typographical error in capitalization. Sayua-Conning Creek, the map of Saginaw and Tuscola with part of Genesee, Lapeer, Huron, and Midland counties, Michigan, gives the name Sayua-Conning to the creek given on the map accompanying the history of Saginaw County as Sayua-Conning Creek. The history also refers to it as Squahoning, or Last Battle River, and it states that the Squahoning Creek South Branch rises in the township of Kochville and following northeasterly enters the Saginaw River about 6 miles from the north. And then Sheboygan Creek. The history of Saginaw County gives the name of this creek as Sheboygan and states that Sheboy Creek rises in Tuscola County and flowing in the northwesterly direction through the townships of Bloomfield, Buena Vista, and Zilwaukee, enters the Saginaw above Bay City. And this account was originally, as I said, published in 1901, and it gives a lot of interesting information that I've not seen before. And so I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have enjoyed it, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and click the bell icon so you're notified of any new video releases. Thank you for taking the time to listen. God bless, and have a good night.